Gave my adopted son my entire fortune only to see him change his locks the next day. Part 1. My name is William Harper, and at 72 years old, I believed I had finally earned the right to live in peace. For 45 years, I built Harper Construction from a one-truck business into one of the most respected companies in the state. Every dollar I earned came from long days, sleepless nights, and sacrifices that most people never saw. My wife, Eleanor, stood beside me through every success and every failure. Together, we dreamed of passing everything we built to a child who would value family more than money. The only problem was that we couldn't have children. For nearly 15 years we tried everything. Doctors, treatments, prayers, and hope filled our lives, but nothing changed. Then one rainy October afternoon, everything did. We walked into an adoption center expecting paperwork. Instead, we met a frightened 6-year-old boy sitting alone in the corner with a broken toy truck. "What's your name?" Eleanor asked gently. The little boy looked up. "Lucas. Do you like trucks?" He nodded. "My dad used to drive one." Those 6 words broke my heart. Within 6 months, Lucas Harper officially became our son. From that day forward, I promised myself that he would never feel unwanted again. For years, our family seemed perfect. I taught Lucas how to ride a bicycle, how to throw a baseball, and eventually how to read blueprints at the construction company. Eleanor filled our home with laughter, birthday parties, and traditions that made every holiday feel special. When Lucas graduated from college, I couldn't have been prouder. One day, I told him, "This company will be yours." He hugged me tightly. "I'll make you proud, Dad." I believed him. Life moved quickly after that. Lucas married a kind woman named Emily, and together they welcomed a beautiful daughter, Sophie. Becoming a grandfather gave me a happiness I didn't know was possible. Every Sunday, Sophie would run through my front door shouting, "Grandpa." Those were the best years of my life. Then everything changed. 3 years after Eleanor passed away, the Sunday visits became less frequent. Lucas always had an excuse. Work was busy. Sophie had activities. Emily wasn't feeling well. At first, I understood. Life happens. But then I noticed something else. Whenever Lucas visited, our conversations somehow turned toward money. He asked about my retirement accounts. He wanted to know whether I'd updated my will. He wondered what I planned to do with the company after retiring. The questions became more frequent every month. One evening, my longtime attorney, Richard Collins, came to my house to review my estate plan. After we finished the paperwork, he closed the folder and looked at me. "William, are you certain about this? I've thought about it for years. You're transferring everything." I nodded. "The company, the investments, the house, my savings, everything." Richard remained silent. "I've represented your family for over 30 years, he finally said. "I have to ask one last time. What, are you doing this because it's what you want, or because you're afraid of losing your son?" His question stayed with me long after he left. The next morning, I signed every document. Legally, almost everything I own now belonged to Lucas. When I called him with the news, he sounded overwhelmed. "Dad, are you serious? I've spent my whole life building this for our family." He arrived within an hour. He hugged me, thanked me repeatedly, and promised that nothing between us would ever change. For the first time in months, I felt hopeful. Maybe I had worried for nothing. Maybe this would bring our family closer together again. The next morning, I drove to my own house after breakfast. Something immediately felt wrong. The front door key wouldn't turn. I tried again. Nothing. Then I noticed the brand new lock. Before I could knock, the front door opened. Lucas stood there. His expression wasn't warm. It wasn't grateful. It was cold. "Dad," he said quietly, "I think it's better if you don't live here anymore." I stared at him, unable to believe what I had just heard. Behind him, I saw moving boxes stacked in the hallway. Family photographs had already been taken off the walls. The house Eleanor and I had spent 40 years building no longer looked like our home. It looked like someone else's. And legally, it was. For several seconds, I couldn't move. I simply stared at Lucas, waiting for him to smile and admit it was some kind of joke. He didn't. "Dad," he repeated quietly, "please don't make this harder than it has to be." "What are you talking about?" I finally managed to ask. Lucas stepped outside and gently closed the door behind him. "I've been thinking about this for a long time." My heart began to race. "You've been thinking about throwing me out of my own house." He avoided my eyes. "It's not your house anymore." Those words hit harder than any punch. Legally, he was right. Just yesterday, I had signed everything over to him. The deed, The company, the investment accounts, the vacation cabin, even the antique pickup truck Eleanor had bought me for our 25th anniversary. I had trusted my son with everything. Now I stood on the front porch like a stranger asking permission to enter. "Lucas," I said, struggling to stay calm, "your mother's memories are inside that house." "I know. My clothes are inside. I packed them. My photographs. They're in the garage. My medications. I'll bring them out." His voice wasn't angry. It was frighteningly calm, almost rehearsed. At that moment, a moving truck pulled into the driveway. Two workers climbed out and walked toward the front door. One of them looked at me. "Sir, are we at the right address?" Before I could answer, Lucas nodded. "Yes." The workers disappeared inside. I watched through the window as they carried Eleanor's piano toward the truck. She had played that piano every Christmas Eve for more than 30 years. I remembered dancing with her in the living room while Lucas laughed from the couch. Now strangers were carrying those memories away. I felt my knees weaken. "Dad." Lucas reached for my arm. I stepped back. "Don't." He lowered his hand. "I've arranged a nice retirement apartment for you." "You arranged it?" "I already paid the first 6 months." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "You made these plans before I signed the papers." He stayed silent. Silence was all the answer I needed. An hour later, I sat alone in the small apartment he had rented. It was clean, comfortable, completely unfamiliar. The walls were bare. The windows overlooked a parking lot instead of the garden Eleanor had loved. My entire life now fit into 6 cardboard boxes stacked beside the sofa. On top of one box rested a framed wedding photograph. I picked it up carefully. Eleanor smiled back at me exactly as she had 46 years earlier. "I should have listened to Richard," I whispered. A tear rolled down my cheek. That evening, my attorney called. "William, I heard what happened." It didn't take long. "No, I made the biggest mistake of my life." Richard was quiet for several moments. Finally he asked, "Did Lucas pressure you before the transfer?" I thought carefully. "No." "Did he threaten you?" "No." "Did he deceive you about what you were signing?" "No." He sighed. "Then reversing everything will be extremely difficult." The room suddenly felt even smaller. "So that's it?" "Not necessarily. There may still be options." Hope flickered for the first time all day. "What kind of options?" "I'll need to investigate a few things first." Before hanging up, Richard added one sentence that stayed with me all night. "Sometimes the truth doesn't appear until people believe they've already won." I had no idea what he meant. But within days, I would discover that Lucas wasn't the only person keeping secrets. And those secrets would change everything I believed about my family. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Lucas standing in the doorway of my home, calmly telling me that I no longer belonged there. By sunrise, I had made a decision. I wasn't going to fight him out of anger. I simply wanted to understand one thing. Why? The next morning, Richard arrived at my apartment carrying a thick folder. "You look terrible," he said. "I feel worse." He placed the folder on the table. "I spent half the night reviewing the transfer documents. And everything is legally valid." I lowered my head. "So I really gave away my entire life?" "Yes." For several moments, neither of us spoke. Then Richard opened another file. "But I also found something unusual." My attention immediately shifted. "What is it?" 3 months before you transferred everything, Lucas quietly removed himself from daily management of Harper Construction. "What? He hired outside executives?" I frowned. "That doesn't make sense. He always wanted to run the company." "Exactly." Richard slid another document toward me. "This is why." Across the top were the words, "Confidential purchase proposal. Someone wanted to buy my company." The offer was enormous, nearly 4 times what the business was worth. My heart pounded. Lucas never mentioned this. Richard nodded. "The buyer requested complete confidentiality." I kept reading. If the sale went through, Lucas would receive hundreds of millions of dollars. More money than anyone in our family had ever imagined. Suddenly, everything became clear. The questions about my will, the transfer, the locks, the moving truck, it had all happened just before the biggest sale in the company's history. I looked at Richard. "Do you think that's why he rushed me?" "I don't know, but the timing is impossible to ignore." That afternoon, I drove to the company's headquarters. For 45 years, that building had been my second home. The receptionist looked shocked. "Mr. Harper." She stood immediately. "I thought you retired." "I did." She hesitated. "Mr. Lucas instructed us that all visitors need appointments." Visitors. After building the company from nothing, I was now considered a visitor. As I turned to leave, an older employee hurried toward me. It was Frank, my first foreman. He had worked beside me for nearly 40 years. Bill, he hugged me tightly. I've been trying to call you. My phone's been off. Frank looked around carefully before lowering his voice. Something isn't right. What do you mean? People are being laid off. I froze. How many? Almost 60 so far. What? They say the new owners want to cut costs before the sale. The new owners? Frank nodded. Lucas has been telling everyone the company will belong to someone else within weeks. I couldn't believe it. That company wasn't just a business. Hundreds of families depended on it. Some employees had worked there for decades. Many had started as teenagers. We had celebrated weddings, birthdays, retirements, and grandchildren together. They weren't numbers on a spreadsheet. They were family. As I walked back to my car, my phone rang. It was Emily, Lucas's wife. Her voice trembled. Can we meet? Of course. I can't talk over the phone. Is everything okay? No. There was a long pause. Then she whispered something that made my blood run cold. William, Lucas hasn't told you the truth about where your money is. The line went silent. I stared at the phone in disbelief. For the second time in less than a week, I realized I knew almost nothing about the man I had raised as my own son. And whatever Emily was about to reveal, it was big enough to make her afraid. I arrived at the small cafe 15 minutes early. Emily was already there, sitting in the far corner with a cup of coffee she hadn't touched. Her eyes were red, as if she hadn't slept in days. When she saw me, she stood immediately. I'm so sorry, William. You don't have to apologize, I said gently. Just tell me what's going on. She looked around to make sure no one was listening. Lucas doesn't know I'm meeting you. My heart sank. What is he hiding? Emily took a deep breath. For the last 2 years, he's been making risky investments. What kind of investments? Technology startups, cryptocurrency, private lending, anything that promised huge returns. And, at first, he made money. I nodded. Then he started borrowing. How much? She hesitated. I don't know the exact amount. Give me your best guess. She swallowed hard. More than $30 million. I felt the blood drain from my face. That's impossible. I wish it were. She reached into her purse and handed me several bank statements. They're copies. I made them before leaving the house. I scanned the pages. Loan after loan. Interest payments. Missed deadlines. Legal notices. My hands began to shake. He transferred your assets because his lenders were demanding repayment. I looked up. So this wasn't about securing the family business. Emily slowly shook her head. It was about saving himself. For several moments, I couldn't speak. Everything I had believed was collapsing. He loves you, Emily said quietly. Then why would he do this? Because fear makes people convince themselves that terrible decisions are reasonable. Those words reminded me of something Helen had once said. Desperate people don't always stop loving you. Sometimes they simply stop thinking clearly. I closed my eyes. How had we reached this point? That evening, I drove past my old house. The lights were on. Through the front window, I saw Sophie sitting at the dining table doing homework. She looked up and noticed my car. A huge smile spread across her face. Grandpa. She ran toward the front door. Before she could reach it, Lucas gently stopped her. I couldn't hear what he said, but I saw her smile disappear. She looked out the window again, confused. I waved. She waved back. Then the curtains closed. I sat in my car for several minutes, unable to drive away. Losing my house had hurt. Losing time with my granddaughter hurt even more. The next morning, Richard called. I've confirmed Emily's information. So it's true. Yes. How bad is it? Worse than we thought. Richard paused. The company isn't just being sold. It's being sold at a loss after accounting for Lucas's debts. I stared silently through the apartment window. So everything Eleanor and I built could disappear. Those words felt like losing my wife all over again. Richard continued. There's one more thing. What? The board of directors hasn't approved the sale yet. I frowned. They can stop it. They can delay it. How long? Maybe a few weeks. For the first time since signing away my fortune, I saw a small opening. Not to get my money back, but to save the company, and the hundreds of families who depended on it. Richard looked me straight in the eyes. If we're going to stop this, we have to act now. I nodded. For the first time in days, I wasn't thinking about revenge. I was thinking about responsibility. Not because I still owned the company, but because I had built it, and I wasn't ready to watch 45 years of hard work disappear without a fight. The emergency board meeting was scheduled for 9 o'clock Monday morning. Although I no longer owned Harper Construction, Richard convinced the board to let me attend as the company's founder. As I walked into the conference room, every conversation stopped. Some directors stood to shake my hand. Others looked away, unsure whose side they should be on. Then the doors opened again. Lucas entered. The confidence on his face vanished the moment he saw me sitting at the head of the table. "Dad, I was invited," I replied calmly. He glanced at Richard, then at the board members. "What is this?" The chairman cleared his throat. "Mr. Harper, before we vote on the proposed sale, several serious questions have been raised." Lucas's jaw tightened. "What questions?" Richard stood and placed several folders in front of each director. "These documents show that Mr. Lucas Harper failed to disclose personal financial liabilities that may have influenced his recommendation to sell the company." The room fell silent. Lucas stared at the papers. "Where did you get those?" Emily slowly walked into the room. His eyes widened. "Emily." She looked down. "I'm sorry. You did this." I told the truth. Lucas pushed his chair back so hard that it nearly tipped over. "You betrayed me." Emily met his eyes. "No, Lucas. I refused to help you betray your father." No one spoke. For nearly a minute, the only sound in the room was the ticking clock on the wall. Finally, one director broke the silence. "Is it true?" Lucas didn't answer. Another director asked, "Did you transfer your father's assets to cover your personal debts?" Still no answer. The chairman leaned forward. "Mr. Harper, we're waiting." Lucas slowly lowered his head. "Yes." A wave of disbelief spread across the room. One director removed his glasses. Another rubbed his forehead. Frank, who had been invited as an employee representative, looked heartbroken. "I worked beside your father for 40 years, he said quietly. "He treated every employee like family." Lucas couldn't look at him. "I know." "No," Frank replied sadly. "I don't think you do." The chairman immediately called for a vote. The proposed sale was suspended pending an independent financial investigation. For now, the company was safe. But Lucas wasn't. As the meeting ended, he walked toward me. "I never wanted it to happen like this." I looked at him for a long moment. "Neither did I." He wiped tears from his face. "I thought if I could sell the company, pay off my debts, and start over, you'd never know." I sighed. "You didn't trust me enough to tell me the truth." I was ashamed. "You should have been honest instead." He nodded silently. Outside the boardroom, reporters had already begun gathering. News of the investigation was spreading quickly. Richard placed a hand on my shoulder. "This isn't over." I looked through the glass doors at my son standing alone in the hallway. For the first time in his life, there was no money left to hide behind. Only the consequences of his choices. And I knew the hardest conversation between father and son was still waiting to happen. 3 days after the board meeting, my phone rang just before sunrise. It was Richard. "William, you need to come to the office." "Is something wrong?" "I'd rather tell you in person." His serious tone made my stomach tighten. 40 minutes later, I walked into his office. Several files covered his desk. Richard looked exhausted. "We finished tracing the money. And the situation is even worse than we expected." He handed me a financial report. "Lucas didn't just borrow from banks." I frowned. "Who else?" "Private lenders." I knew exactly what that meant. Unlike banks, private lenders often demanded repayment quickly, and they rarely accepted excuses. "How much does he owe?" Richard took a deep breath. "Just over $42 million. I closed my eyes. 42 million. It was almost impossible to imagine. How did this happen? He kept borrowing to repay previous loans. A debt spiral. Richard nodded. Exactly. For several minutes, neither of us spoke. Then another question came to my mind. What about Emily and Sophie? Richard sighed. They don't know everything. They're still living in the house. For now. I stood and walked toward the window. Everything I had spent a lifetime building was now balancing on the edge of disaster. That afternoon, there was another knock on my apartment door. When I opened it, Sophie threw her arms around me. "Grandpa." I hugged her tightly. "I've missed you." "I missed you too." Emily smiled sadly from the hallway. "I hope you don't mind. She wanted to see you." "You're both always welcome." Sophie spent the afternoon drawing pictures while Emily and I talked quietly in the kitchen. "Lucas barely sleeps anymore," she admitted. "He thinks he can still fix everything." "Can he?" She slowly shook her head. "I don't think so." Just then, Sophie walked into the room holding a drawing. It showed the three of us standing in front of my old house. Above it she had written, "Family belongs together." I felt tears forming in my eyes. Children often understand what adults forget. Late that evening, my phone buzzed. It was Lucas. "Dad." His voice sounded weak. "Can we meet?" "Where?" "The old construction site on Oak Street." The first one, yes, I'll be there. An hour later, I found him sitting alone on a stack of wooden beams where Harper Construction had built its very first home 45 years earlier. He looked older than his age. The confidence that had once defined him was gone. I used to come here with you after school, he said. You'd let me hold the measuring tape. I smiled faintly. You always wanted to help. I stopped helping a long time ago. Neither of us spoke for several moments. Finally, Lucas looked at me. I've lost almost everything, I answered quietly. No, he frowned. You still have a chance to tell the truth, accept responsibility, and rebuild your life. He shook his head. I don't deserve another chance. I remembered something Eleanor used to tell me. The people who believe they don't deserve forgiveness are often the ones who need it most. I looked directly at my son. Lucas, forgiveness doesn't erase consequences. He nodded. I know, but it gives you a reason to face them. For the first time since this nightmare began, he cried openly. Not because he had lost money. Because he finally understood what his choices had cost. As I placed my hand on his shoulder, I realized this wasn't the end of our story. It was the beginning of the hardest road either of us would ever walk. The morning after my conversation with Lucas, I received a call from Richard. They've scheduled a meeting with the lenders. Today, yes. Should I come? I think you should. An hour later, we entered a downtown office building where several representatives were already waiting. Lucas sat alone at one end of the table. He looked exhausted. Dark circles surrounded his eyes, and his suit, once perfectly pressed, looked as though he had slept in it. One of the lenders began the meeting. Mr. Harper, we've reviewed your proposal. Lucas nodded nervously. We're rejecting it. The room fell silent. Unless, the lender continued, you agree to liquidate every remaining asset under your control. Lucas closed his eyes. There won't be enough. We're aware of that. For the first time, he didn't argue. Instead, he quietly signed several documents accepting responsibility for the debt. When the meeting ended, none of the lenders shook his hand. They simply gathered their files and walked away. I had never seen my son look so alone. Outside the building, Lucas sat on a bench staring at the sidewalk. I thought money would solve everything, he whispered. It solved nothing. I sat beside him. When your mother and I adopted you, we promised we'd always tell you the truth. He nodded. I remember. But somewhere along the way, you stopped believing you could tell us yours. Tears filled his eyes. I was afraid you'd be disappointed. I would have been disappointed by the debt. I looked at him, but never by your honesty. He buried his face in his hands. I ruined everything. No, you damaged a lot, but damaged things can sometimes be repaired. That evening, Emily invited me to dinner. For the first time in months, all four of us sat at the same table. Emily served Eleanor's favorite chicken casserole. Sophie smiled from ear to ear. Grandpa's home. Lucas looked around the table. I forgot what this felt like. I answered softly. So did I. After dinner, Sophie disappeared into her room and returned carrying a small jar. Inside were dozens of folded pieces of paper. What's that? I asked. My kindness jar. She handed it to me. Whenever someone does something nice, I write it down. I unfolded one note. Dad helped Grandpa after his surgery. Another read. Grandpa came to my school play. Then I found one written in shaky handwriting. I hope my family stays together forever. I couldn't hold back my tears. Children don't care who owns the house. They don't care who controls the company. They simply want the people they love to stay together. Lucas quietly wiped his eyes. I'm sorry, Sophie. She hugged him. It's okay, Daddy. No, he whispered. It wasn't. Later that night, as I drove back to my apartment, I realized that forgiveness isn't a single moment. It's a journey. Every honest conversation, every apology, every act of kindness, every difficult choice. Those are the small steps that slowly rebuild broken families. I still didn't know what would happen to the company. I still didn't know whether Lucas would ever recover financially. But for the first time since I signed away my fortune, I felt something I hadn't felt in a very long time. Hope. Over the next several weeks, the investigation into Harper Construction finally came to an end. The independent auditors concluded that the company itself had been managed honestly for decades. The financial crisis wasn't caused by the business, it was caused by Lucas's personal investments and the loans he had hidden from everyone. The board gathered one final time. Richard stood and addressed the room. After reviewing every record, we have reached our recommendation. Everyone waited. The sale of Harper Construction is permanently cancelled. A quiet wave of relief spread through the room. Frank smiled for the first time in months. Dozens of employees who had feared losing their jobs embraced one another in the hallway. The company had survived, but Lucas still had to face the consequences of his own decisions. The board voted to remove him as chief executive officer. Instead of arguing, Lucas stood and nodded. I understand. He looked around the room. My father spent 45 years earning your trust. He lowered his head. I almost destroyed it in two. With that, he walked out of the boardroom. Several days later, there was another knock at my apartment. Lucas stood outside carrying a large cardboard box. I found these in the attic. Inside were Eleanor's photo albums, old family letters, my military medals, and the worn leather journal where I had written every major milestone of Harper Construction. I should never have taken these from you, he said quietly. They belong with you. I looked through the box. Every item carried a memory. Every memory reminded me that a family's history could never be measured in dollars. Come inside, I said. We spent the afternoon looking through old photographs. There was one of 6-year-old Lucas holding that broken toy truck from the adoption center. Another showed Eleanor teaching him how to bake cookies. A third showed all three of us standing proudly in front of the first Harper Construction office. Lucas smiled sadly. I spent so many years chasing money that I forgot I was already rich. You were, I replied. You had a family that loved you. Months passed. Lucas accepted a modest management job at a small local construction company. There were no luxury offices. No expensive suits, no company car. He started over from the bottom. Every paycheck went toward repaying his debts. Every weekend, he volunteered with Habitat for Humanity, helping build homes for families who couldn't afford them. One afternoon, I visited one of the construction sites. Lucas was carrying lumber alongside workers half his age. His hands were covered in dust. His clothes were stained with paint. When he saw me, he smiled. I finally remembered why I fell in love with construction. Why? Because it's about building lives, not just buildings. I couldn't have been prouder. That evening, we sat on the tailgate of his pickup truck, watching the sun set over the neighborhood we had helped build. For the first time in years, neither of us mentioned money. We talked about Eleanor, about Sophie, about second chances. As the sky turned orange, I realized that losing my fortune had forced us to rediscover something far more valuable. The love that had made us a family in the first place. Nearly a year had passed since the day I stood locked out of my own home. Looking back, it felt like a lifetime. I had moved into a modest house on the edge of town. It wasn't nearly as large as the one Eleanor and I had shared, but it was peaceful. Every morning, I watered the flowers she loved, drank coffee on the porch, and watched the neighborhood wake up. One Saturday morning, a moving truck stopped in front of my house. I frowned. I wasn't expecting anyone. A familiar voice called out, "Grandpa." Sophie jumped out of the truck and ran into my arms. Behind her stood Emily, then Lucas. "Dad," he said nervously, "we need to talk." I invited them inside. Once everyone was seated, Lucas slid a folder across the table. "What is this?" "Open it." Inside were legal documents. I looked at the first page and froze. Property transfer agreement. My old house. My eyes widened. "Lucas, I've transferred it back to you." I stared at him in disbelief. "You don't have to say anything. I sold almost everything I owned," he continued. "The luxury cars, the vacation condo, my watches, everything." "Why?" "Because none of it ever belonged to head of my family." I slowly closed the folder. "I don't want the house back." He looked confused. "You don't?" I smiled. "No, the house was never what I wanted." "What did you want?" "My son." For several seconds, no one spoke. Then Lucas broke down in tears. He walked around the table and hugged me harder than he ever had before. "I'm so sorry, Dad. I know. I'm ashamed every single day. I know. I'll spend the rest of my life making it right." I placed my hand on the back of his head, just as I had when he was a frightened 6-year-old boy meeting us for the first time. "You already started." Emily quietly wiped away tears. Even Sophie understood that something important had happened. She smiled and whispered, "Does this mean we're a family again?" I looked around the room. At my son, my daughter-in-law, my granddaughter. Then I answered with complete certainty. Yes, for the first time in a very long time. We were. The day after Lucas offered to return the house, I asked him to meet me at the cemetery. He arrived carrying a bouquet of white lilies. Without a word, we walked together to Eleanor's grave. For several minutes, neither of us spoke. The wind gently moved through the trees, and the silence felt almost comforting. Finally, Lucas knelt beside the headstone. "Mom," he whispered, "I'm sorry." His voice cracked. I know you can't answer me, but I need to say it anyway. Tears rolled down his face. You and Dad gave me a home when nobody else wanted me. You gave me your name, your love, your future, and I nearly threw it all away. I quietly placed the flowers beside the headstone. Lucas continued, I spent years believing success meant owning more than everyone else. He looked at me, but standing here today, I realize I was already the richest kid in the world the day you adopted me. I couldn't stop my own tears. For the first time since Eleanor passed away, I felt as though one chapter of our family's pain had finally come to an end. A few weeks later, Harper Construction celebrated its 50th anniversary. The board invited me to give the opening speech. Hundreds of employees filled the warehouse where the company had begun decades earlier. Many had worked beside me for 20 or 30 years. Others were young apprentices just beginning their careers. I stepped onto the stage and looked across the crowd. I've been asked many times what the secret to building a successful company is. The room grew quiet. People expect me to say hard work. I smiled. Hard work matters. They expect me to say discipline. That matters too, but neither is the most important. I paused. The greatest investment you'll ever make isn't in buildings, machines, or money. It's in people. The audience applauded. I continued, if you take care of people, they'll help build something that lasts far longer than profit. When I finished speaking, the room rose to its feet. As I walked off the stage, I noticed Lucas standing near the back. He wasn't in a suit. He wasn't sitting with the executives. He was standing beside the construction workers. He smiled proudly and applauded louder than anyone. That moment meant more to me than any business award I'd ever received. After the celebration, Lucas handed me a small envelope. Open it later. That evening, I sat alone on my porch and unfolded the letter. It read, Dear Dad, you once told me that being a father isn't about sharing blood. It's about sharing love, sacrifice, and time. You chose me when you didn't have to. I forgot that. I hurt the man who gave me everything. I can't change the past, but I promise I'll spend the rest of my life earning back the trust I broke. Thank you for never giving up on me, even when I gave you every reason to. I'll always be proud to call you my father. Love, Lucas. I folded the letter carefully and placed it inside Eleanor's old wooden memory box. Some treasures aren't measured by money. They're measured by the people who grow because of the love they've been shown. As the sun disappeared below the horizon, I smiled for the first time in a long while. Our story had begun with betrayal, but it was ending with redemption. 5 years later, I was 77 years old. Age had slowed my steps, but it had also given me something I never had when I was younger, perspective. Every Sunday, my house was filled with laughter again. Lucas and Emily arrived before noon, and Sophie, now a teenager, still burst through the front door shouting, Grandpa. Some traditions never changed. She still helped me bake Eleanor's famous apple pie. We still ate dinner at the old oak table that had survived every chapter of our family's story. One afternoon, Sophie asked a question that caught us all by surprise. Grandpa, what's the most valuable thing you've ever owned? Lucas looked down, already knowing the answer. I smiled. For a long time, I thought it was my company. Sophie listened carefully. Then I thought it was my house. I shook my head. I was wrong. She tilted her head. What was it? I reached across the table and held Lucas's shoulder. My family. The room fell silent. No amount of money can replace the people you love. Sophie smiled. I'm glad you didn't give up on Dad. So am I. Lucas quietly wiped away a tear. A few months later, Harper Construction opened a new training center for young apprentices. The building carried a simple name, the Eleanor Harper Training Center. Above the entrance was a bronze plaque with her favorite quote, Character is built one honest decision at a time. During the opening ceremony, the chairman invited Lucas to speak. He stepped to the podium and looked at hundreds of employees. There was a time when I believed success meant owning everything. He paused. I almost lost the only person who truly loved me because of that belief. He looked toward me. My father taught me that wealth is temporary, but integrity lasts forever. The audience applauded. After the ceremony, several young apprentices thanked him for sharing his story. One of them asked, if you could go back and change one decision, what would it be? Lucas smiled sadly. I would have asked my father for help instead of trying to solve everything alone. That answer stayed with everyone who heard it. Years passed. Sophie graduated from college with the help of the scholarship fund her grandmother had inspired. She chose to work for a nonprofit organization that built affordable homes for struggling families. When reporters asked why she had chosen that career, she simply answered, Because my grandparents taught me that the best way to honor what you've received is to help someone else. As I watched her leave to begin her new life, I realized Eleanor's kindness had reached another generation. On my 80th birthday, Lucas gave me one final gift. It wasn't expensive. It wasn't rare. It was the broken toy truck he had been holding the day we first met at the adoption center. He had spent months restoring it. I kept it all these years, he said. You remembered. I never forgot the day you chose me. I held the little truck in my hands, unable to speak. Some memories never lose their value. Late that evening, after everyone had gone home, I sat alone on the porch watching the stars. I thought about the frightened little boy who had become my son. I thought about the mistakes we had both made. I thought about the day I signed away my fortune. If I could relive my life, I would change many decisions. But I would never change one. Choosing Lucas. Because being his father had been the greatest privilege of my life. Money built my business. Love built my family. And in the end, only one of those things truly mattered. 10 years after the darkest chapter of our lives, Harper Construction looked very different from the company I had built with a single pickup truck. It was larger, stronger, and more respected than ever, not because it earned the highest profits, but because it had become known for treating people with dignity. Every new employee heard the same story during orientation. Not the story of business success. The story of integrity. The board had created an annual award called the Eleanor Harper Integrity Award, presented to the employee who best demonstrated honesty, compassion, and service to others. Lucas attended every ceremony. He never stood on the stage. He preferred to sit quietly among the workers. When people thanked him for helping save the company, he always gave the same answer. My father taught me how to build buildings. My mistakes taught me how to build character. One autumn afternoon, Sophie visited me with exciting news. Grandpa, I got promoted. I knew you would, she laughed. But that's not the best part. What is? I'm getting married. Tears filled my eyes. Eleanor had dreamed of seeing that day. Although she wasn't there in person, her love remained woven into every part of our family. Months later, the wedding took place beneath a large oak tree in the same park where Lucas had learned to ride his bicycle decades earlier. Before the ceremony began, Sophie walked over and hugged me. I have something to ask. Anything. Will you walk me down the aisle? I smiled through tears. It would be the greatest honor of my life. As we walked together, I thought about the frightened little girl who had once written "family belongs together" on a piece of paper. Now she was beginning a family of her own. The ceremony was simple. No extravagant decorations. No unnecessary luxury. Just people who loved one another. Exactly the way Eleanor would have wanted. Years continued to pass. My hair turned completely white. Walking required a cane. But every Sunday, the family still gathered for dinner. Lucas cooked. Emily baked desserts. Sophie and her husband brought laughter into the house. Then one spring afternoon, they arrived carrying wonderful news. We're having a baby. Lucas looked at me with tears in his eyes. Dad, I smiled. So I'm finally becoming a great-grandfather. 9 months later, a little boy was born. They named him Ethan William Harper. When Lucas placed the baby in my arms, I whispered, "Welcome to the family." Looking into Ethan's tiny face, I understood something that had taken me an entire lifetime to learn. Money can create comfort, success can create opportunity, but only love creates a legacy that survives generations. On my 85th birthday, Harper Construction dedicated a small community park beside its headquarters. At the entrance stood a simple stone engraved with these words: "A person's greatest wealth is not what they leave behind, but the lives they help build." Employees, neighbors, friends, and former apprentices gathered for the ceremony. Many shared stories of how the company had supported them through difficult times. Some had received scholarships, others had found jobs when no one else would hire them. Several families said the company had paid medical bills they could never have afforded. Listening to those stories, I realized my greatest achievement had never been constructing buildings. It had been creating a culture of kindness that continued long after I stepped away. As the ceremony ended, Lucas gently placed an arm around my shoulders. "You were right, Dad." "About what?" "The fortune wasn't the greatest inheritance." I smiled. "No, what was?" I looked across the park where children laughed, families talked, and employees celebrated together. "This. Not the land, not the company, not the money, the people, the relationships, the second chances, the love that had outlived every mistake." That evening, I sat on my porch one final time, watching the sunset paint the sky with shades of gold. The restored toy truck rested on the table beside me. The family photographs filled the living room. Laughter echoed from inside the house as another Sunday dinner came to life. I closed my eyes and silently thanked Eleanor. Our dream had never been to raise a wealthy son. It had been to raise a good man. For a while, we thought we had failed. But people are not defined by their worst decision. They are defined by what they choose to become afterward. Lucas had become the man we always hoped he would be. And I had learned that forgiveness,